some of you who are on the call are familiar with our work as a coalition. Some of you are actually, have a huge amount of experience or expertise with restorative and transformative justice, and then there's other folks who aren't. So we're going to really try to avoid using jargon and insider terms and things like that. But please, 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 if something's not making sense or you don't understand something, please chat to Liz, and she will interrupt us and let us know to explain our terms. So as I was saying, we've known for a long time that survivors actually, turn to systems as a last resort when they need help. And if any of us think about who we go to when we need help, it's usually our first choice is not usually the police or a domestic violence program or a medical provider or anything like that. We usually go to our family, friends around us. And we've also known for a long time that many systems don't work well for survivors, and especially not for survivors who are folks of color, refugee or immigrants, LGBTQ, or facing other kinds of marginalization. And one of the things I want to say is that there have always been domestic violence and sexual assault programs that have done intentional work around engaging communities and engaging communities both in supporting survivors and holding people who have harmed them responsible for making change. A lot of that groundbreaking work actually has been done here in the Seattle-King County region. And most of this work has been done within organizations working within specific cultural communities. And it's often not being seen as really legitimate or something that's applicable to more mainstream organizations. But there has been increasing interest in finding alternatives to criminal and other kinds of systems responses to gender-based violence, and especially when issues of institutionalized racism of the criminal legal system are so front and center right now. So the one thing I want to say is that, is that, the reality is that there are a range of opinions within our coalition about whether and to what extent our programs, our movement should be continue to engage with the criminal legal system, and with some folks wanting to totally dismantle whole systems and others who want to engage with reforming it. But I think there are a lot of places where we can agree, and especially we agree that survivors need more options. So we decided that we wanted to dedicate some of our agency resource to exploring these ideas and finding out where we can support a whole range of perspectives and also activities that are looking to promote better options for survivors or more options for survivors. So.
Okay. And I think that, in the spirit of it being more of a conversation and a chat and a coffee chat at that, we really wanted to kind of open it up for Merril and I to get to talk maybe more honestly or openly just about what is it that we really think, and that to not have that be representative necessarily of the coalition stance on anything in particular. So
this is the disclaimer.
Yeah,
this does not reflect the opinion.
There are no, yeah. And also, that it's true that Merril and I have different opinions and that we're different people. And, we wanted to just sort of be really upfront, if at all possible, just to begin with about what some of those differences are. And so some of the most important ones we just wanted to get out of the way. And I drew pictures that we realized shortly after opening the video that they might not really come up. So, if anybody's ever known Merril before, they know that
I'm a coffee drinker.
And I am a tea drinker, actually. And, another really important difference that I think a lot of people on the call probably have some feelings about is actually the most important thing, for sure. We know the numbers in our office, and probably many of you on the call, we know what you are, but Merril is
I'm a cat person.
and I am definitely a dog person. And then maybe on to something that's a little bit more on point. I really strongly identify as a prison abolitionist, and I see that Shannon Perez Darby is also on the call. But, you know, as just, yeah, somebody, and Merril.
And I would say that I'm an incrementalist, but I have some definite abolitionist tendencies.
So we just wanted to be able to, yeah.
It's really awkward taking jokes and not telling jokes and not getting any feedback if people are rolling their eyes or, so moving on.
Yes, and Liz, I'm glad to know we're outnumbered. Liz is also a dog person.
Yeah, I got my peeps next door.
But, you know, I think it's been an interesting thing for us to figure out, like, how do we move forward around this work, and how do we think about it? And, you know, I guess the first thing that I wanted to, Merril mentioned this in her introduction, but I think I just want to try to start-ish by saying, you know, when I talk about transformative justice, one of the things that I think about is actually just so much of my experience, my own lived experience around domestic and sexual violence, and the people that I wanted to connect with and get support from, and that those really were all friends and family. And so I think about things like when a kid knows that, you know, or like when a kid knows that his dad is drunk at home and he's got an auntie that he can call and she can say, hey, you know, the last time your dad was drunk at home, he beat you up. Like, do you want to come stay the night at my house, right? And also that auntie could call up her brother and say, hey, like, do you want to make a different plan for your life? Because when you're drunk, you beat up your kids, right? And so the kind of that transformative justice piece of just like being willing to like recognize domestic and other kinds of gender-based violence happening in your own community, and being able to make plans and kind of engage with people on that level, not knowing that, you know, the point that somebody is calling an advocate is actually pretty, it's a different point, and definitely the point that people are involved with systems. All the way up until, you know, something that is more organized or refined, like maybe a group of people getting together after a couple that breaks up, where we know that there's domestic violence happening in the relationship. So, and Merril alluded to this in her introduction, but, you know, some of the work around what I think of as like the basis for transformative justice really comes from community accountability, and some of the ways that we think about that now is really rooted in the work of CARA, Communities Against Rape and Abuse, which is an organization that was here in Seattle in the late 90s and early 2000s, and was really focused on looking at gender-based violence that was happening in the African American, Black and disability community, as well as the queer and trans community, and with young people. And you know, there's great articles out there, and we can send some follow-up information about that, but there was just so much amazing work that came out of this, the necessity for looking at the intersection of state violence, so violence that's allowed, encouraged, you know, from the state, like, you know, I would say that prisons fall into that category, the militarization, all kinds of things like that, and what the way that domestic and sexual violence looks at. So, you know, I think like one thing I'm thinking of is just when people are saying like that we need to report if there's like domestic violence happening or sexual violence, and knowing that just the act of reporting or engaging with police in any way can also be like a threat to the people that are wanting that kind of support. So I wanted to talk a little bit too just about the differences between transformative justice, restorative justice, and community accountability. And we actually wanted to just briefly do a screen share so that you could see this chart that's been really helpful in my work, and we hope will be useful for you all. This chart was developed by Mimi Kim, who worked at the Asian Women's Shelter for a long time in San Francisco, and then also started an organization called Creative Intervention. And she's a PhD in the UC system at Long Beach. So this is just sort of breaking down what some of the differences are between restorative justice, transformative justice, and community accountability. But you know, one of the big pieces is that we've really seen restorative justice or restorative practices be utilized in the criminal legal system in this country and in other countries. And transformative justice really has a, an attempt at least, or the intention around like really rejecting the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system. And we also see that with community accountability. And it's not to be talking about those two things as, so, if somebody is involved in a process that's, transformative justice or community accountability process, and then they decide that they do need a parenting plan or they do need a protection order, that's not really what we're not trying to make the distinguish about like how cool you are, how much shade you're going to get, but it's just more about trying to talk about, what are some of the ways that we've seen these, some of these ideas really come into our field and into our work. I think that, yeah, I feel like there's a lot more I could do.
Do you want to pause and see if there's questions about that specifically?
Sure.
Anyone, before we move on, if anyone has a question they want to put in the chat box?
I'll let you know.
Okay, we'll keep going.
And, while we're kind of talking about people doing holding, or I think one question we kind of had was, I guess like an example of a restorative justice process is really like a circle process. And when I talk about circle process, it's really, I'm just reminded of the ways that Native and Indigenous communities on this continent, but really, I would say from a lot of different parts of the world, including in my own family that's mostly from the Pacific Islands, just really seeing the way that, holding a circle, getting together, and I'll try to explain a little bit, but when I say circle, I really mean like an opportunity for people to come together, sit in a circle, decide what their values are, and for everybody to get a chance to speak, right? And to kind of go through the process in that way until we come to a conclusion. And that so much of the leadership and development and really like gracious sharing has come, when we talk about restorative justice in Seattle, has come from Indigenous and Native communities here, and particularly communities in the Northeast. So yeah, just wanting to recognize all the wisdom that's been like so generously given to this community and to other communities around restorative justice.
Okay. Yeah, so I think the thing about like the circle, and there are other practices like that can be used in restorative justice programs. They can also be used in like transformative justice and community accountability. It's the context and the in which they're happening that I think makes the distinction. And I think that certainly we've seen a lot of concerns, particularly within systems and the criminal legal system, where there have been attempts to use some of these practices in ways that have been done well, and then in other ways where they maybe haven't been done as well, or when these and I think that the danger is when sort of like these individual practices are taken out of context and just put into another context without a lot of thought. But that doesn't mean that there's not value to them, or that there's any one practice is the be all and end all for everybody. So
yeah, and I guess too, like we're not necessarily like encouraging or saying that everybody needs to be like involved in these processes, but we are really interested in I think part of my job has been just sort of seeing like what's the work that's already happening in as a part of our membership, and that's connected to this work and kind of uphold some of these values. And so, in our membership, sort of a little bit on the outskirts of some of our membership is some really amazing programs that, one of the ones I like to talk about a lot is called Age Up, and they're like a Frisbee social justice organization, like really like building community, making the opportunity for people to get to learn about social justice and, gender-based violence mental health issues, all these things that are in a liberatory way while they're already doing something that they are connected to and love. Another organization does a lot of work with API Chaya and does, and they're called Collective Justice, and they do many things, but one of the reasons that I started to know about them was they were doing groups around accountability in Merril prison. And one of the great learnings from that was just like getting to hear about how important it was to be able to do healing work in conjunction with accountability work, that we couldn't sort of expect people to be accountable without there getting to be a place for them to also get to do healing. And they're also doing like statewide policy and many, many things. But, you know, I think we are, like I said, talking about CARA and other organizations, like we're really fortunate to live in an area where there's so much of this going on, and people that have been kind of looking at it and thinking about it even before it got cool, you know, or it got to be the thing that the state is also interested in looking at and thinking about. So another place where we've tried to look is just, you know, where there is restorative justice processes or practices going on, trying to, and maybe not with a focus on gender-based violence, wanting to be supportive of those communities to get to learn more about gender-based violence. And I guess the last thing for now that I'll say is just this thing about how, like, this really is we're really in a process of learning so much, and mostly we're in that place, right, to get to be like learning from other communities. And that and the questions that we got for this were so amazing, and that there's just so much more to be said about all of this, including the things that Merril and I just tried to talk about in 10 minutes or less, but that didn't happen. So we're sort of biting off more than we can chew, and we kind of know that, but we wanted to be able to engage as much as we could honestly with you all.
Yeah. And I guess the one last thing I wanted to say before we get into some of the questions that came in, were part of your role and part of the work we're trying to do is to, you know, raise up some of the perspectives and knowledge and learning from the organizations that are engaging in transformative justice work and working, you know, trying to work with folks who are maybe working in programs that are not anywhere in the immediate or near future going to be launching full restorative justice or transformative justice programs or, you know, work, but like we do think that there are a lot of principles and practices that could be transferable. So like, how can we make what we're learning from restorative and transformative justice work applicable to advocates, because in general, because I think that there's a lot of philosophical alignment around that, and a lot of places where the work does overlap. For example, talking to survivors about how to, you know, in our one-on-one work with survivors, talking to survivors about how to engage their informal support systems and friends and family members. So.
And I think, you know, that so much of advocacy actually already is, you know, connected to this work, and to not, you know, it's actually like, it's not, most of what, at least what I did as an advocate, was not talking to people about involving themselves in systems or going to the police or kind of things like that. But it really was, I got to do a lot of work around like supporting people to like, okay, if you can't, you know, get an appointment with an advocate, or if you can't get an appointment with, you know, whoever else, like, who's a friend that you can call, right? And I think so much of safety planning, and even just thinking of safety planning as like an active verb, right, and something that we're active in, safety planning, I'm actually not sure exactly who all is on the call, but, you know, is an activity that we try to skill survivors up around, just like being able to think critically about like what's the safest thing that they can do for themselves to keep them as safe as possible, as often as possible. And I think of safety planning as a skill and tool that all of us could really benefit from, right? Like what's the safest way to like ride the bus right now, or what's the safest, you know, how can we be good drivers or things like that. So yeah, there's different concerns, but I think also something about just really recognizing how connected we are to to people that are surviving currently or who have in the past, and then also all of the survivors just in our movement that, you know, but not sort of thinking about it just as like a separate group of people. Yeah.
So, should we go on to some of the questions?
Yeah, so we got a couple of questions leading into this event, and I'll just throw out the first one, which will definitely be paraphrasing. But we received a question from someone who's a researcher and working with community partners, and those community partners have been getting increasing requests for more restorative approaches to gender-based violence. And so the question that was posed is, how do we begin to imagine or evaluate whether or not a particular situation or a person or group is quote unquote right for a restorative justice practice?
Well, I think, you know, so much of, I'm so conscious of like how much work so many people have done in this realm, and I'm thinking again of Mimi Kim and her really talking, you know, when she's talking with advocates, really saying like, what is it that the survivor is asking for? And so often it's not, you know, it's not about shelter space. It's not about the person that's harmed them wanting that person to go to jail, right? It's about wanting to have a safe place to live, wanting for people to not be harmful anymore, right, to them or to somebody else. And so I think when I'm thinking about people calling and sort of trying to evaluate, like, oh, do I want to connect them with a couple of programs locally that do more of this kind of work, I'm kind of listening for and thinking about, like, is the person asking for and interested in the person that's harmed them also getting support and help, right? And is that a priority of the person that's talking, right, or that's asking for support? You know, and I think often too, you know, we're hearing not just from the person that experienced harm, but maybe from like a parent or a family member or a friend. And I think that that's another opportunity just to be able to really be like offering some of these ideas and resources. And you know, I'm really interested in the state like not being utilized at all. So in my mind, and really thinking about things around like mass incarceration and how. So I think that, you know, I think there's an argument to be made that in so many cases, right, that there's opportunities for this. And I think a time where I think that the smaller kind of set of things is actually people who aren't interested and who want to pursue other things. And I think that those people get to be supported in that as well, right? And I don't actually, the API Chaya and the Northwest Network to some extent and other programs that are doing this work in a different kind of way are also able to support people who want to get a protection order, right? API Chaya just hired a family law lawyer, you know, like people who want to do parenting plans, things like that. Like we know that for some people it has to be, and it must be like a both and.
Yeah, and I guess again, trying to think about, you know, being an advocate on the helpline or something, and having someone call and say, like, where can I go for a restorative justice or transformative justice intervention? I know, you know, I think that so much of the conversation can be, well, there are a few places that might do that, but it's not like we have a long referral list of, you know, all these organizations that are officially offering to facilitate these processes to, you know, anyone who wants to do it. And for me, it just keeps coming back to, as with any advocacy question, like when a survivor is saying, this is what I want, even if those resources aren't necessarily right there, or even if your program is not going to do that, as an advocate, we can still be having conversations, as you said, like, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you're wanting to accomplish? And what do we know about the likelihood? It's like whenever we talk about any accessing any resource or any system. Oftentimes what survivors may think like, I've heard a lot that I want to be heard. I want a chance to have my side of the story validated, and I want my day in court. And we have those conversations with folks about what's likely to actually happen in court, and is this the best way to get that sense of validation? And so again, I think it just really is talking through with somebody, what is it that they want, what are the resources that they have available to them, what do we know about the resources that are available in the community, what are the pros and cons, and have them think through how to evaluate that themselves. Like you said, is there, it doesn't necessarily have to be an organization. Who does their, who are their support systems, and what do they need from their supporters, and how can they talk to folks about that, and who does the person who caused them harm listen to, and is that somebody you can talk to and ask for support up from that person?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, when I've done trainings in different parts of Washington State too, just, one of the questions that comes up is, I hear you talking a lot about community, like what do we do with all of us, our survivors who don't have any community? And I think that I have sort of like a pretty simple answer to that. That's not actually simple in the work, but the words that I say are simple, which is that you help them build community, right? And how do we as programs sort of get to be a part of scaling up, and by scaling up, I mean like supporting them to learn skills to be able to support survivors, right? And I just want to clarify too, they're actually, like, if you are having situations where a person is really asking for some kind of process to happen, it is useful to give somebody like me or, another person in a similar position a call and just see if there's somebody that could actually do that. And I just want to clarify that, it's not the case that I mentioned the Northwest Network earlier. It's not the case you can call the Northwest Network. And when I worked with the Northwest Network, people would call all the time and say, can you do a community accountability process for us? And that's not really quite the way that it works at the network at this moment. And I think that the network does so much work already around engaging people to think about how do we bring in friends and family, right? And how do we support survivors to really build and maintain and really like nurture those bridges, right? And to get the support that's already available to them in their own lives. And just to be, another thing that happens with the network is the relationship skills classes, and just sort of an opportunity to get to build the skills that you want for the relationships or build the skills you need for the relationships you want, right? And so I think that those are some other kinds of examples for programs that are just saying like, well, what's the point of this for us? And I think that those are some of the things that I really think about and how do we see those things as being connected? Yeah.
Liz, is there anything? I saw some things coming through the chat too.
One of the things that came through the chat is Priya just reminded us of the great resource that's called Stumbling Towards Repair. And there's an assessment worksheet within that of community accountability makes sense for the situation. So that is a resource. And maybe I'll just move on to the next question. Or did you want to?
I think I just was also thinking about just this specific example from maybe Priya's on the thing can say, but there's a resource that has a lot of different like audio clips of stories around community accountability. I think it's called stopeverydayviolence.org. And there just is one story that I've used in trainings and stuff to kind of talk about like it was actually like a mother who like reached out to the person that was causing harm and really talked with, and the community sort of decided like, oh, this is the person that he would listen to, right? So I guess I just wanted to offer that up a little bit too.
So I guess
we'll put that resource in the follow-up.
Yeah, we'll put the resource in the follow-up for sure. one of the next questions, I guess, or just kind of things to think about, was kind of in the face of all of this harm and things like family separation and anti-Black violence and crushing capitalism, what is it that we can actually do?
Cricket.
In 24 hours or less. Obviously, this is an incredibly complex question, and just I think it's important to, first of all, just acknowledge that this is the context in which we're trying to do this work. There's not one easy answer for this, other than we have to be paying attention to what's going on, understanding the context, and working to change all of these things. And it's looking internally in our own programs, at our own racism and the other ways that these issues and oppression play out, and understanding the huge stakes that that folks in our communities are facing. I think that the question does, it does really reinforce for me the need for community-based solutions that has always been there and is even more important. And we're seeing that in terms of, all of the immigration rules that are just, communities are not going to, not just the criminal legal system, but social service organizations, healthcare, all of those kinds of things, because of legitimate fear that their information might be disclosed to ICE, they might, the whole public charge rule, which is a whole other issue, but basically said that if you access public services, that could be used against you in immigration, deciding about your immigration status ultimately. And luckily, in the last week, there's been a court ruling that's put that on hold, but that's not over yet. And so there are very, very real reasons why folks are not, never have, and increasingly, it's just not an option to access systems. So it just totally reinforces for me the need to do a lot more around community-based solutions. I guess the one other thing that's a little bit of an aside, but very relevant to this issue is, for organizations and systems looking at data and the data that we collect. And, for a long time, domestic violence agencies specifically have been talking about the potential harms that could happen to survivors through if their individual identifying information isn't protected. And what the response has been is mostly to provide exceptions for survivors of domestic violence, but that does not take care of the problem. And it's not only survivors who are harmed by all these things. So I think now is really the time to look at all of these things and say, like, if we're trying to offer different kinds of assistance in our different kinds of services, our number one thing needs to be that we're not collecting information that's going to be used against people. So a little bit of an aside, but a particular passion for me.
Yeah. I think too, like on a systems level, both organizationally and when we're thinking about like local government or larger government, just really staying clear about like what is it that our goals are. And I think that it's something that I think about a lot, is just how do we stay clear about what it is that we're working towards, right? Like the goal of the movement, of the anti-domestic violence movement, or wasn't that people could go to a shelter, right? Or even the goal wasn't for people to be safe necessarily. It was to live it was to have liberation, right? And to get to like not just be safe, but get to like thrive and have big, full, happy lives, right? Where they're getting to make decisions and be the center of their life. And I guess to me, there's a thing about really wanting to make sure that we kind of are able to maintain enough clarity about what is it that our goal is, and how do we direct our resources towards those goals, right? And
right.
so how do we think about, how do we start to sure, I think that as a coalition, right, like investing in things to be doing reform, and I think that we need to spend so much more resource on building up community, similar to some of the discussions I think in the prevention community around what if we redirected some of our resources towards doing prevention in our communities, to talking to young people about healthy relationships, to talking to people that have caused harm, right? To just be engaged with like, how do we stop the harm from happening for sure, and to support people that are experiencing that harm, but to really be thinking about like putting our money, really putting our money on those things. And I mean, and that's something that, that comes up, I would imagine, for a lot of people when they're thinking about how do we move forward. And then I think that some of the more finite things about like, what do we actually do right now? I think one of them is really some skills around like, how do we stay connected with each other? I just got to hear Shannon Perez-Darby actually talk about a book reading just about this thing around like, how do we have the skills that we need to be able to stay connected to people even when we're having conflict with them, right? Even when we're having disagreements or when we're really upset, right? How do we stay connected enough to be able to do that? And I think that kind of applies also, as a coalition, to being able to stay connected to systems or to other folks that we disagree with, but being able to kind of keep pushing forward, but also I'm talking about interpersonally, right? I think there's a big thing for me too around like not doing the work that you need to do for yourself so that you don't lose hope, right? That we don't lose hope or sight that like that liberation is possible, and that we can not only be like getting safe from violence, but like really leading the lives that we want to live, And so I just want to give an example of that, of like both this thing about like, for me, it's really been about connecting to like, who are my people, both like from a like cultural perspective, but also just like in my life right now, like who are the 3 families I see like every week or every other week, and who am I building with? And then like getting to experience joy when it's happening, For me, that's like a karaoke playlist in the car that I listen to all the time, and just like, and doing the work to be able to notice that something is joyful, right? And remembering that, and thinking about something as liberation, just not as the place that we want to get to one day, but as a place that we can have moments of now. I know that is not maybe the answer exactly that people are wanting, but I think that's the best approximation that we kind of have right now.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like one other thing specifically about the immigration and ICE is that, again, this is a little away from transformative justice and your great like visionary thinking, but there are workshops being offered in our community now about like what to do if ICE comes to your door. And I actually had an experience that, I mean, it does relate in terms of sort of like, can we create rapid response networks? And I started getting texts, and it was this totally informal thing about some information that one of our member domestic violence programs was actually being raided by ICE, and what could we do? And this informal texting and emailing circle happened, and we quickly found out that it was actually that an apartment building across the way was being raided, or at least there were immigration ICE officials outside waiting for somebody, which not that that's horrible too, but the program that was, the domestic violence program that was across the street had already been to a training, they had protocols in place, they, they locked all the doors, they got in touch with residents who were out and told them not to come back, and they told the residents who were there to stay. I mean, they just had this whole protocol already in place, and I was really heartened to see that. So
Yeah.
that's
I want to
Yeah.
throw in a
Mhm.
comment
Mhm.
from Natalie, who's saying that she's noticed that the conversation is oftentimes centered around domestic violence, and wondering if you have any additional thoughts or considerations around sexual assault or stalking that you could share.
Sure. As far as thinking about transformative and restorative justice?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Sujata Baglia was just here in April and also in May and doing a lot of work, but she just was awarded a MacArthur Award, right?
Yeah, Genius Award.
The Genius Award, okay.
MacArthur Genius
The
Award.
MacArthur Genius Award, and so this will be also in the resource thing we definitely wanted to send out. But I think that people often think that, yeah, I think when folks doing sexual assault field hear about restorative and transformative justice, they think, oh, that's not for us. And Sujata is actually somebody who spent a lot of work really looking at specifically that intersection of restorative justice and sexual violence. And so I think that that's been really useful to me. I think in some ways, in my mind, it doesn't actually feel separate. That when I think about the possibilities of restorative justice around childhood sexual abuse and for people to really, and I think the primary thing for people to know about all of these practices around restorative justice and transformative justice is the first thing that happens is that the harm has to stop, right? That we don't, that everybody, that is a value that's like that is like the number one thing. And I think that, and to know that when the harm that doesn't necessarily stop when people leave their homes, right? That when we have, in our society, that when people leave their homes, that there's still violence that is happening. We have to be able to kind of look at that and contend with that. And so, in my mind, it doesn't feel clear that that these are practices that would lend themselves better to domestic violence situations than sexual assault. But I do think that people often kind of get stuck with that. And even people who have been doing restorative justice processes for a long time often have the idea that they can't do it around gender-based violence. And that's actually something that doesn't exist outside of a U.S. context. That's something that's been really, it's a very political thing. And it is true that is the way that some of the ways that restorative justice practices haven't been used for these kinds of cases historically within a criminal legal system, but absolutely 100% have been being used in communities by community to address these issues. And if you look at some of the websites, or if you look at I think Sujata has a lot of really amazing specific stuff, but the website that we shared, I think at least half of the stories in there are about sexual violence. And if there's ever a shortage of those things, I'm happy to kind of share that. But I mean, again, when I think about my own experiences, these are the kinds of responses that I would have liked, and the things that happened that were closer to this were better than the things that happened that weren't.
Right, and I think another thing is reasons why, I'm not saying this is true for you, Natalie, but for many people when they hear about these practices, there can be this this idea of, or just the misperception that sexual violence is primarily done by strangers. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, you're talking about people who are in relationship with each other, and often in long-term ongoing relationship or proximity. So, so it is kind of the same idea. There might not be the same incentive for somebody who has, was sexually assaulted by a stranger, or, somebody they don't have, a dating situation where they didn't have an ongoing relationship. And restorative justice and transformative justice practices are often used in situations where there isn't a close relationship between the people, but more often there is that relationship there. I mean, I think about the example that came up in that workshop we did a couple of years ago, where there was a family member who there was a young woman who had been had an assault had been assaulted by the young person her age in a neighbor's who was a neighbor, and the families are continuing to live together and live in their houses and trying to maintain a relationship. And so that was an example of, it wasn't even about stopping the harm from happening. It had stopped, but just sort of like, how do we continue to have an ongoing relationship with each other without minimizing the fact that this happened, but also not just, never talking to each other.
Yeah. And I remember this situation. I also just thinking about Generation 5 is an organization in the Bay Area that's, working to end childhood sexual abuse in the next 5 generations. And they put out a redo of a document around transformative justice connected to childhood sexual abuse. And one of the resources that was listed actually was a study that, a study and resource that was offered in Germany that was, for people to be able to call up a hotline. Similar to like the men's checkup that was here in Seattle, but, if you were concerned that you were having thoughts, or you were concerned about harming a child in that way, that there was a number you could call and actually talk to somebody about what your concerns were, and then to get support for that without it being connected to, and so, this was like really an attempt to try to have something that was preventative, like a before something happened kind of situation. But I think about, if community was in a position, if people in community with folks that were having these kinds of concerns could actually talk to somebody they already trusted and knew and get support, right? That it wouldn't just be a hotline that would be invested in that kind of harm not happening, right? It would be anybody that could have a chance to stop that harm from happening that would be interested. And I think the problem is around like just being able to imagine that that is possible, and then thinking and figuring out like what are the skills and tools that someone would need to be able to support that person, right?
So we only have 5 minutes left.
Of course, Merril was worried we wouldn't have enough questions. I knew that we would go on and on.
Neither of us are brief.
But maybe just you could think about if you have any closing words. And also, I just want to acknowledge that Ward had a specific question. He was just wondering if either of you knew of any work that's being done with neurodiverse populations in transformative justice, and he's specifically thinking about examples of stalking that he's heard of on high school and college campuses, and how many times that someone on the spectrum is engaging in that behavior, and then once engaged and educated in a neurodiverse approach, that behavior stops.
I don't think that I know of like a specific thing like that, but I guess I think with so much of this, like there are actually so many resources and so many people thinking about it. And where I know that you had another question about, about kind of starting, like trying to do something that was around like, I don't know, that's a bigger thing. But I just am thinking about, I think that we could ask the right people and kind of find out about something like that. But I don't off the top of my head know of somebody that's doing. But I do think that there's just so much, I think that there's so much work happening in like disability justice community around these things. I think Mia Mingus is a writer that could be really interesting to talk to about that. She does a blog and I'm sure lots of other things. Yeah, so I think that we could probably find out if that was happening in a way that was find outable.
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, Mia Mingus. Yeah. I guess I just feel so thankful that people wanted to show up and do this, and then also just very like, you know, kind of even embarrassed about like how much more there is to say and how little we can kind of get out in this format, but really in any format. And yeah, I see that Priya is letting us know that Leah Lakshmi is also a great person thinking about disability justice and transformative justice. I mean, I think that we have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of leaders, but those are two really great folks that actually have like published documents and things like that. So it'd be a good starting point. The Icarus Project, I'm sure there's some stuff there. So, but I guess I just do want to say something about how this work really has come from and is really centered, and I think it's important to stay centered in queer and trans and people of color and queer and people of color and Black trans women, and they're so indebted, you know, to these communities, some of which I'm really identify with and I'm a part of, and to figure out how to support the leadership of those communities, even when we're folks that have a lot of privilege and could step out and get a grant to do some sort of like, you know, what's it called, evidence-based practice. Like, I'm sure that we could go ahead and do an evidence-based practice transformative justice thing, but I really just want to figure out how we can use this as an opportunity to like lend our resources and our access and our privilege to folks that have already been doing this work for so long.
And on that note, do you want to talk about
So,
upcoming opportunities?
yeah, so on November 16th, from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., myself, some folks from API Chaya and Collective Justice are coming together to do a report back about a conference that several of us went to, a couple of us that went for 3 days. Some of those people are on the call right now. That was called the Accountable Communities. It was Accountable Communities Conference, and really looking at, you know, what is some of these things that we're talking about? What does transformative justice mean, like, in practice? And so we're going to be doing a report back from that conference and sharing what we learned as much as we can. Again, it'll be longer, but I think that it'll still feel short. And there is a Facebook event for it and a really pretty flyer. So that will be happening on Saturday, November 16th. And we would, you know, love to invite you and for you to all to invite your folks. And was there something else I was going to
Talk about the advocate.
so API Chaya is also doing a cohort for people that are in community that's similar to their natural health care model about like getting to learn. I don't know, Priya, if you want to put this on here actually, but so basically an opportunity for folks in community to get to scale up, to get to learn some more skills. And we're planning to do a cohort. And cohort, I just mean like instead of doing one-off trainings, get to do trainings that are like building on top of each other over the course of next year for people to get to learn more about transformative justice and community accountability and get to practice it in some kind of way, some ways, but getting to be like a learning, practicing space and over next year. So there'll be more information coming out around that, but trying to really build like a group of people that are thinking about this.
Great. So I'll just be brief and say thank you all for participating in this and being our guinea pigs when we try out this new, I love guinea pigs, by the way, when trying out this new format. And I think Liz is just going to close with some logistics.
Yeah. So one last final logistic is that we would love to hear your thoughts about this experience. And when we were doing some planning around this, we decided to come up with a little short survey. It should take maybe like 4 minutes. And DeAnn had shared that in working with some consultants that one way to get folks to commit to filling out surveys, and especially communities of color to fill out surveys, is that we get people to do like a little verbal confirmation. So I'm curious if people would be willing to, and hopeful that people can just type in the chat box saying like, yes, or like, I will fill out the survey. And that link will go out today a little bit later, along with a bunch of the resources that we've mentioned in this chat. So I will personally just say, yes, I will fill out the survey. And if you can do that too, that would be great. And
Thank you.
Yay.
Coffee.
Water.